to have one of our own members presenting to us. Marc, N4DR, who's going to talk to us about Parasets. So let me tell you a little bit about Marc, very impressive person. He was first licensed in 1966 while still in high school. Marc continued his interest in the hobby throughout college, medical school, and residency, and operated from the university club stations whenever possible. And his first job out of anesthesia residency was at a hospital with an amateur radio station. How about that? Marc is a practicing anesthesiologist, and his wife and all his children hold amateur licenses. Marc enjoys all modes on the air, and he especially enjoys the modes where he can have a good conversation with other stations. So thanks, Marc, for joining us tonight. And now it's over to you.
Okay, very good. I'm going to see if we can make this thing work. Stand by. I'll need screen share privileges. And I'm waiting for my...
You've got them.
Okay, great. Okay. Okay. And you see that? The Paraset?
Not as yet.
No, we're just seeing you.
Okay. All right, Paul, you'll have to advise me how I can get screen share on.
You have a green button on the bottom that says share screen.
Yeah, it's permitted for everybody. You should hit the green button and then select what program you want to share.
Okay.
You don't have the things on the bottom: mute, stop video, participants chat, share screen.
Stand by one. All right, let me go back here. All right, stand by.
You have to have what you're going to share open before you try to share.
Right, no, I have it on my screen now. Let me see. All right. Okay, so I'm in a window now that says, among other things, share screen.
Yep. Green.
Should give you options: share window, share.
He's got it. He's
Oh,
got it.
Okay, we're good now. All right.
There you go.
Good. Let me just get this centered a little bit. Okay. All right. Can everybody see the Paraset, the World War II spy radio? Great.
Yep.
Okay, so this is more of a history type of talk rather than a electronics talk. I mean, obviously we'll talk about the electronics, but I find the history to be much more interesting. First of all, what is a Paraset? Well, the Paraset was a radio, a transmitter, and a receiver, which was very basic and was used by special operations executive agents from England, and they provided these radios to resistance groups in occupied Europe during World War II. All these units were hand-built initially in Bletchley Park and later in Wadden. They were hand-built, and there's quite a few different variations. They all share some general principles, which we'll get to in a minute. I think it's important to know about the history of the beginning of World War II and how desperate things were looking after Dunkirk. As you remember, Dunkirk was where the British were able to extract their military, about 300,000 British troops and about 100,000 French. And they were able to get them back to England. Unfortunately, they lost all their equipment. They could only bring the people out, but not the equipment. So it was looking as if Germany might well be able to invade the British Isles and take over. So Churchill made a speech in June 1940, which is just after Dunkirk. And he said as follows: "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the streets. If this island or a large part of it is subjugated and starving, which I do not for 1 minute believe, then the British Empire, armed and guarded by the British fleet, shall carry on the fight until in God's good time the new world comes forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. So this was a very, very dark time in the United Kingdom. They had their soldiers back, but they lost almost all their equipment. Now, the New World started to provide them with equipment very soon thereafter, so it was not as bad a situation as it appeared initially. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the design criteria. The first and most important thing was it needed to be easy to use and repair. In other words, anything that wasn't absolutely essential for the receiver and the transmitter to work was not included. And even such simple things as a volume control was not included. So that's, something we take for granted, but was not available on these particular units. Another item was it needed to be lightweight. A lot of the bigger radios were quite heavy, and to lug 30 or 40 pounds worth of radio in a suitcase sort of invited people to start asking questions. The Parasets needed to be easily repaired from common parts from either old or broken receivers. Now, when the Nazis occupied the country, the first thing they did was tell people to turn in their radios, and they had lists of people who were in possession of radios because most of the countries issued licenses, and this was true in England also, so that you could own and use a radio. But some people had several radios, so they gave one to the Germans and they kept the rest for themselves. The Paraset had to be small enough to be hidden in a small wood box or metal box. The later versions were all in metal boxes, and we'll get to that in a minute. It needed to be able to receive AM, namely the BBC, and it needed to be able to copy CW. So the need to copy the BBC was that there will be, as we'll talk about a little bit later, there were messages that were included in the regular BBC programming that was special messages to the various resistance groups who were listening, and they were messages that indicated to the resistance groups that they needed to take certain actions for which they were already being prepared. Power level was 4 to 8 watts, which was dependent on the power supply and the antenna. The radios needed to be rugged enough to survive parachute drops, hence the name, although most of them were not dropped by parachute. Most of them were delivered by a small plane along with the British agents that were being introduced into those countries, but some were dropped by parachute. A big item was they needed to be able to tune random wires without an accessory tuner, meaning, again, this was a unit that was very, very basic, and they didn't want you to have to deal with any additional items other than the trans receiver itself. And last but not least, it needed to use the various voltage levels that were dependent on the voltage in the particular country where they were dropped, and they could also be used with a car battery because they had a vibrator power supply, and some were even used with a bicycle wheel generator. And there's a very interesting picture, which unfortunately I didn't get a chance to copy, of one of the agents in a barn in Paris, or I guess it was more like a factory or an industrial area in Paris. And behind the individual was somebody that was turning a bicycle wheel using the pedals, and that was generating the power. Okay, the original assembly site was Bletchley Park, as we talked about, and later in Wadden. It's about an hour by train from London. The official name was Wadden Mark 7. An earlier version was Wadden Mark 5, but it was very heavy and not very well designed, so it was not popular for very long. Okay, let's talk about design. It basically was a trans receiver. It wasn't a true transceiver because the unit used a regenerative receiver, and a crystal controlled transmitter, and you switch from one to the other, which included switching the antenna and the power using a knob on the front of the radio. So there was no Vox, there was no instantaneous switchover. It was all done manually. Now, tune-up was done with 6-volt flashlight bulbs that were built into the front of the radio, and I have a picture of what those looks like. Meters were definitely out because they couldn't survive rough handling. And you can imagine something that is kicked around and dropped and, carried in various conveyances and so on. A meter would not survive. So they used these 6-volt flashlight bulbs. And this was also an item that was readily available. So if the flashlight bulb burned out, you just needed to find a flashlight and you were back in business. Now, all contacts were made using split frequency, which meant that if they were in contact with London, London would be transmitting on one frequency and they would be transmitting on another. And London would be listening on their frequency and they'd be listening on London's. Obviously, if they were both on the same frequency, this made it easy for jammers and also helped the Germans to locate not only the transmitter of the agent, but also to listen in to the response from England. Okay, let's talk a little bit. Again, this is more history than electronics. The risk to radio operators. Well, the Germans were very, very sophisticated for their time in using direction finding techniques. And they had major listening posts in all the cities which they occupied. And they utilized a number of people at any of these particular stations using a variety of receivers, essentially monitoring the entire HF band. And whenever they saw a signal that they didn't recognize or a weak chirpy signal, which was one of the items that would identify a paraset, and we'll get to that in a little bit, then they would take bearings and figure out what particular district or area or village the hidden transmitter was in, and then they would send out the vans. And the vans would have directional antennas. They'd have operators inside, and they'd also have portable direction finding units, which were placed under the clothes of direction finding troops and that were dressed in plain clothes. So when the van got nearby, they'd drop a few of these fellows off, and it was really quite clever. They had them under their overcoats, and the directional antenna was on the front of the operator, and he had what looked like a wristwatch, but was actually a signal strength meter. So he could walk around and look at his watch and tell whether the signal was strong or weak, and thereby locate the transmitter. There was always a risk of discovery by the German police or the local police, or being turned in for reward by collaborators. That was a big problem. In the beginning, Allied agents were told to operate for only 15 minutes at a time. Later, the German DF units became so fast that the operating time was reduced to 5 minutes. That's not much time. Allied agents needed to change location frequently because, as I said, the DF vans and the main direction finding stations were constantly looking. And once they found a signal that was suspicious, they'd get a bearing. And if you were there for much longer, especially if there were direction finding vans nearby, you were in serious trouble. Risk of discovery was increased by having to suspend long wires for antennas. And remember, the Paraset was designed to tune just about any random length of wire. The sad part is if captured, and about 25% of them approximately were captured, the agents faced torture, concentration camps with all its privations, and then finally execution. And approximately 1/4 of the operators never returned home. Okay, what was the fate of these Parasets at the end of the war? Well, a lot of them were destroyed in the field by the agents, and those that were returned to England were taken apart for parts. And why did they do this? Well, they were afraid that some of these units would fall into Russian hands, and the Russians would use them against the British and the Allied forces in the years after the war. There's only a few surviving sets. It's estimated there's only about 40 or less original sets, and most of these are in museums in England, Netherlands, Belgium, and Norway. And these were the countries where the Parasets either were constructed in England or where they were used, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway. There are a few in private collections, and a Paraset, an original Paraset, when it hits something like eBay, has gone for as much as $6,000. So they're pretty rare. Now, how do you tell an actual Paraset from a reproduction? Some of the reproductions are absolutely brilliant, and they look exactly, I mean, down to just to the painting and everything, the way they're put together, they look exactly like a Paraset. So people have put some of these reproductions on eBay and have sold them and claim that they're originals when they're not. So how do you tell? Well, each of the original Parasets had a serial number, and it was marked on a little plaque, and the plaque was mounted on the front of the radio with rivets, not with screws, not with glue, but with rivets. So if you don't see a plate with rivets, then you know it's probably a reproduction. Total units actually manufactured may have been as many as several thousand. The captured units that were captured by the Germans were destroyed usually fairly soon after. And the British, as I said, destroyed the other units. Okay, so modern replicas of the Paraset. Some amateur operators have built replicas using original parts and tubes. Some of the parts are no longer available, but people have been very inventive in creating parts that are no longer available. Like, for example, the key, which you'll see at the end here with the photographs, which is built into the unit itself, it was very difficult to fabricate. It was very specialized. So people have used different kinds of switches and such to recreate the key that was built into the radio. And some modern parts have been used to replace those that are hard to find, like antenna connectors and switches. The originals aren't made any longer. Now, a lot of people say, well, where do you get tubes for something like this? I mean, after all, the radio is going on 80 years old now. So, and the tubes that were used were six SK7s and one 6V6. So the 6V6 was the transmitter, and the two SK7s were the receiver. And we'll see this in the schematic, which I'll show you a little bit later. And surprisingly enough, these tubes are still available on eBay for about 10 to 20 bucks each. They're very common. Okay, there's some kits now that are available or were available that one can create a Paraset, as it were, using modern materials. Now, these this particular one, called the Bayou Jumper by 4-State QRP Group, is all solid state, not a single tube anywhere, as is the Para 80 and the Para 40 by QRP guys. And these are kits that you can build, and they both of them have the same design philosophy as the original, which was a regenerative receiver and a crystal controlled transmitter. And the modern ones, however, have a few extras like volume control and so on. So this one is not available any longer. They just finished the 4th run of 100 of these, and they're going to be running a new run shortly. So if anyone wants to build one, keep an eye on the 4-state QRP group website. Now, there are people who are trying to recreate the use of Parasets on the air. And one of the activities is sponsored by the 4-state QRP group called London Calling. And how this works is at a specific time and date, a setup is done such that the Parasets and the Bayou Jumpers attempt to work higher power stations who act as quote unquote London stations. Now, the original stations in England used between 250 and 15 kilowatts to communicate with agents in occupied areas. Needless to say, they were pretty loud, and that was a good thing because the receivers in these Parasets were pretty basic. The English stations used massive and multiple receive antennas to copy weaker stations in Europe. For example, the distance from northern Norway, where Olaf Olsen was operating from, near the Telemark site where the Nazis were attempting to create a nuclear bomb, the Norwegian resistance blew it up, and Olsen was their radio operator. And he's a very interesting character. He actually survived the war and went back to Norway and lived to about 85. So he was one that was able to get away, and many of them unfortunately didn't. London calling activities can include London stations sending messages to agents, like those that were sent via BBC AM broadcast during the war. So what the BBC used to do was they would have a session with every transmission of programs. They would say, and now we have special messages for our friends. And these messages might be things like Jasmine is playing her flute, or the beef is tough, or the moon is bright. Different things like this had coded meanings for the resistance groups in Europe, and they were then to take action based on what the message was to them. So nobody except the people in England and the resistance fighters knew what these messages meant. Also, agents in this activity can give weather reports, and there's a telegraphic shorthand that includes barometric pressure, temperature, dew point, and wind speed and direction. Now, this kind of information during World War II was very important because obviously they weren't getting weather reports from occupied Europe. So if they wanted to plan a bombing run or something, they had to have some idea as to what the weather was going to be like. And the agents in Europe were helping with that. Now, as far as the transmissions in this London calling, we're fully identified with legal call signs, and messages are in plain language. This is one that was actually used on the day before D-Day. It is hot in Suez. But in our activities, there's no hidden or coded meanings that are used. Of course, that would not be legal if we did that. Okay. All right. Now, this is a Paraset. This version is in a metal box. Over here are the two sockets for the 6 SK7s. One is a regenerative detector, and one was an audio amplifier. This was the tube 6V6, which was both an oscillator and an amplifier. The crystal was here. And these are the flashlight bulbs used to tune up the radio and the antenna. We'll get to that in a minute. Here's a built-in key. So you didn't need an external key, but some of the versions did have provisions for external key. This is a switch that switched between the two possible receive bands. This is transmit receive switch here. This is regeneration control, and this is fine tuning. So if you were in a hurry, use this knob, but if you were trying to tune in CW or other stations that were very narrow, it helped to have fine tuning. F6EJU is an elderly gentleman who's done considerable research and construction of replicas. His father was an agent in France, and this particular unit belonged to his father. Notice the rivets on the plate. Okay, this unit, slightly different, but still the same principle. This is actually Olaf Olsen's unit, which I have a picture of him using his unit during the war. And this gives you an idea. This is in a small suitcase, a leather suitcase. Notice the box is metal, and we'll talk about the reasons for that in a little bit. And here's your two S6SK7s, your 16V6. This is a crystal. They were very different crystals, and we're going to talk about that. They were round. They were called Blaley crystals, very rugged. You could play football with these things, and they would not be damaged. Okay, these two knobs here are capacitors that are used to tune the antenna and to tune the radio. This is the vibrator power supply, and it has two potential ways of being used. You could use it plugged into 220, or you could hook it to a car battery. And that is, this is the design showing where the different components go and what the different knobs are used for. And these were the code sheets. And I'm not going to get into codes and ciphers and all that sort of thing, but obviously all the transmissions both from London to Europe and from Europe to London had to be encrypted before they were sent. Okay, now this is Olaf Olsen, a very famous operator, and he's shown here operating his Paraset up near Telemark. And he was in communication with London, and the Nazis were really trying to find him. They literally committed hundreds of troops and lots of equipment to find him, and they never did. So he was very clever about how he hid his antennas, and he kept his transmissions really short. Obviously, everything was CW. That's a very unusual key. That's not a typical key like what would have been issued as an external key. And if you look here, you'll see the internal key in the Paraset. Okay, this is a close-up of that area with the light bulbs. The tank indicator you would tune for maximum brightness using this capacitor. And once you had maximum brightness here, you would tune the aerial using this capacitor for full brilliance. And when both were fully bright, then you knew you were properly tuned up. This is the switch for the receiver, not the transmitter, that allowed you to switch between the 2.5 to 4.5, and then there was a 4.5, I think, to 6 or 7 megahertz. So you could switch between the two. And this is the CW key again. This is a crystal. They're very big crystals, but again, they were very rugged. So that was why they were different. Here's what the tubes look like. The tubes in the Paraset, unlike a lot of the other tubes, were all metal, meaning the outer part was not glass, it was metal. Now there was glass inside that held the different elements, but the metal tubes survived rough handling better than the glass ones. There was only one small problem. The only country in the world that was making metal tubes was the US. So essentially, when they started making these things, they had to order tubes from the US, and all the tubes that were used in the real Paraset were the metal case tubes. Okay, there's an example of crystals. I don't know what this crystal is about here, but notice the spacing is quite wide and the crystals themselves are quite thick. And notice the size. This is a 220-volt plug for 220 volts, which is the most common voltage in Europe. And the crystals were designed so that their pins and their spacing was exactly the same, so that the Parasets could use commonly available plugs for 220. Sockets for 220. Okay, now this is what partially assembled replica looks like. Again, the 2 tubes and then the 1 tube. This is the transformer for the transmitter and the receiver. This is the crystal socket. These are the tuning capacitors I mentioned. This is the reaction control. And this is a modern jack. They had a very different style of jack for the headphones. Okay, now this is a replica fully assembled. Notice how crowded everything is. And the real Parasets were even worse. Now, you know this one's a replica, not only because everything looks nice and clean, this is a piece of PVC. PVC was obviously not used on the originals. Okay, this is a schematic of the Paraset. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I just want to explain what the different tubes do. Let's start with the receiver. This is the antenna. So the signal would come from the antenna to the receiver down to here, and this transformer would allow you to tune for the frequency with this capacitor that you were listening to, or you wanted to listen to. And as you saw, the dial was graded by numbers, so each number represented a particular frequency, and then you could tune between the different frequencies using this capacitor. The signal then went to the regenerative detector, and the signal was then amplified and fed back in a regeneration method, so that a tiny signal coming from the antenna could be multiplied millions of times so that it would be strong enough to go to the audio amplifier tube, which would then go ahead and feed the headphones. Now, the regeneration control, which allowed the regeneration to be set in one of 2 modes, either just before the oscillation mode if you were listening to AM, or just at the oscillation mode if you're listening to CW. And notice that there's switches here, and they're manually switched. The voltages are switched, and the antenna is switched by a gang switch here. The common ground is here and along this bus. The 360 volts for the tubes, which came from the vibrator supply or from the AC coming out of the wall through the power supply. This is powering the receiver tubes here and here. And when it was in transmit, it powered the single transmitter tube. Now, these are the indicator lamps, as I mentioned earlier. This lamp helps to tune the output tank circuit. And when this is bright, you then go over to here and you tune this capacitor so that this bulb is maximum brightness and you're tuned up and ready to go. The key is here and the crystal goes here. And the crystal, as mentioned, is plug-in. Okay, last but not least is Sierra Mike 7 Uncle Charlie Zulu, and a lot of these slides were his. He is very big and doing reenactments and very big at building replicas, and he builds a lot of really, really nice replicas that really look like the real deal. And this is him literally out in the field using one of the replica units that he constructed. How are we doing for time, Alex?
We have lots of time. Fascinating subject.
Okay. All right. Well, now comes the part when I'm sure everyone has something they want to ask. So let's go ahead. I'll put Alex in command here. You, since you're the host, when people raise their hands or indicate they want to speak, go ahead and unmute them. Okay.
Sure. If you could unshare, if you can
Okay, we
bring
can
us
do
back to the
that.
gallery view.
Okay.
Great. Perfect.
Okie dokie. Let's go ahead here. All righty. And
Great. So Fred has a question.
yes, go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, Mark, I was curious. So, did they have a particular schedule for using certain frequencies at certain times, or how do they know that? And I was curious about how many different frequencies they have, because it seems like they'd have to have a ton of crystals, or how much variability do they have using one crystal and then the tuning them?
Well, most of the agents had 1 or 2 crystals. So they didn't really have a lot of crystals and they couldn't change their frequency. Why was this important? Well, their signals were weak and the British were listening for these weak signals. And the British, of course, had, calibrated receivers and all that sort of thing. So they were able to listen to the specific frequency where a specific agent was located. And they did have schedules, and the schedules varied depending on where the agent was and what the conditions were. Most of the time, the agents operated on one frequency, and the frequency chosen was dependent mostly upon the distance involved. For example, somebody in Belgium, which was pretty close to the British island, could use maybe 3-4 megahertz, whereas the fellow in, say, northern Norway, which is 1,000 miles away, would probably use 7 or 8 megahertz for his assignments. So, and they were appropriately crystalled. The receiver, of course, covers from 2.5 up to like 8. So they could receive England wherever England happened to be transmitting. But again, this is all prearranged. Does that answer your question, Fred?
Great.
Okay. Next.
So Bob has a question.
Go ahead, Bob.
Let me ask 2. I'll just rattle them both off. How fast was the Morse code that they were using? And did they have to carry batteries around? There didn't seem to be any place to hold batteries.
No, these radios were not intended to be used with portable batteries. They were intended to be either plugged in or they could be used with automobile batteries. In fact, automobile batteries were safer than plugging in, because one of the tricks the Germans would use when they located what they thought was a hidden transmitter, say in an apartment building, they would go and they'd throw the circuit breakers on each floor individually. And obviously when the signal disappeared, they knew that the agent was on that floor somewhere. So it didn't take a whole lot of effort to start knocking on doors. So it was safer because if you're running battery, the Germans could not do that. Now, as far as the Morse is concerned, the agents were required to be able to receive 15 words a minute as part of their training. Some of them were very fast. There was one woman agent whose code name was Princess, and she could copy 25 words a minute. But the people in England had been told, okay, this is the speed you're going to know, not more than 15 words a minute. And remember, everybody was using straight keys. Nobody was using bugs. Nobody was using keyers. Of course, keyers hadn't been invented, but it was all using straight keys. So the speed was slow and everything was, as I say, encrypted, and it had to be really well encrypted with no extra information or extra anything, because they had a very short transmission time. And they had to be able to do that with a straight key and still stay under 15 words a minute. Does that answer your question? Good. Okay, who else here? Go ahead, Vic.
Yeah, I wanted to draw your attention to Alpha Hotel 6 Charlie Yankee, who was instrumental in, I think, in piquing everybody's interest with the publishing of his book. If you notice, he's on here tonight, so you might want to say hello to Hiroki. And also regarding CW key, that key that Sam built for me, Sam Cabbage, that was, what was it now, WT7 key? Now I forgot.
WT8, Mark 2 and versions 1, 2, and 3. That's what this is right here. This is a WT8. This is the original deal. And it's a Mark 2. So this actually was a key that was used when an external key was available for use with the Paraset, and when it had a jack for the external key. And this is what it looked like. And I picked this up actually from a fellow at a ham fest, believe it or not. He didn't know what he had. These things are somewhat unusual, but they are very, very nicely built. This one was filthy when I got it, and it's now been.
This is the one that Sam built for me.
Yeah, beautiful. Sam did
Right
an
from
incredible,
scratch.
incredible job.
Yeah, beautiful.
The work on his key is just amazing.
I want to say hello to Hiroki out there.
Hello, Hiroki. Do you
hope he's
have
still here.
any comments you'd like to add, Hiroki, as far as mistakes that I've made or anything you'd like to add?
Maybe he stepped away.
He may have stepped away. That's fine. Okay. All right. So we
Well,
have
we have more
Glenn,
questions.
N4DR, and Glenn is another amateur in this area who has built a Bayou jumper. And go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, hey everybody. Glad to see you have such a great turnout, Mark. It's a really interesting and hot topic. One of the items I'd like you to touch base on is talk about the type of antennas that these people were using.
Okay, well, it's very simple. They used long wires, and the longest wire that they used was 70 feet, but obviously you have to have some height and some distance in the clear in order to have a 70-foot one. And a lot of the agents, because of the need to be hidden and so on, were using long wires that were 20 or 30 feet long. And 20 is not very long, but as I said, the Paraset was designed to tune just about any kind of long wire. So that was what they used.
Very good.
Let me get one of my Paraset, my Bayou jumper, so I can show you that. I didn't have a good picture of a Bayou jumper, but let me get that for you now. Okay, this is what the Bayou jumper looks like in a wooden box. And the wooden box that fits the Bayou jumper, you can purchase either locally from Hobby Lobby, or you can purchase it online. This looks very similar to the original box. Looks like an ordinary box. No labels, nothing. This could be a tea box. Okay, this shows the lid, and notice I have marked on the lid what approximate receiver frequencies are. Can everybody see that? Okay, and this is the unit itself. Let's see, okay. And again, it's very similar to the real deal. This is receiver, this is transmit receive. The power jack is here, the key is here, and the headphone is here, the key jack is here for an external key, and the internal key and the crystal would go up here. And if you look real close, you can't really see, but when you get your Bayou jumper, they give you a little label that says, if service is required, contact MI6. Of course, MI6 didn't exist in those days. It was called the SOE. So that's what it looks like. And it's basically 2 circuit boards. There's a faceplate on top, just like the original. And there's volume, regeneration, and the attenuator. This is another thing that the Bayou jumper has that the original did not have. And with a simple regenerative receiver, you don't have much selectivity, and they didn't know from crystal filters or any of that sort of thing. So the way they would sharpen the band spread, if you wish, or sharpen the bandwidth, would be to reduce the attenuation control. On the real thing, there was no attenuation control. So this one has an attenuation control, and it sure helps when you're on 40 meters at night and all the foreign broadcasts and stuff. So by using the attenuator, you can make it easier to copy the ham signals. Any questions about the Bayou jumper? Okay, this is a version 1. They've gone through 4 versions now. There's a white and a blue and a green and a red. Now they're all basically the same circuits, but they're different runs. So you could see which run you had based on your color. And the first one was white.
And
okay, who else has a question?
David?
I was going to ask, are the Bayou jumpers tube type in a similar circuitry to the originals? But my real question was, do you happen to know if the agents carried any spare parts, such as tubes or those tuning light bulbs? And do you have any sense of the duty cycle, how much time they spent listening for instructions versus giving reports?
Everything was scheduled very, very tightly, and they knew when the British operators would be listening for them, and they would be on the air during that period. And again, they had to have very short periods of transmission. But one of the problems with a regenerative receiver is that the way it's designed, the receiver tube, detector tube oscillates. And so this was a potential giveaway to the Germans. If they knew what frequency the agent was listening to from England, then they could direction find on the output of the receiver. Now, there's 2 ways of preventing that from happening. During World War II, they put the radios in metal boxes, which cut down on the radiation of the oscillations from the receiver. Now, a couple of the replica builders out in the West tried to see how far away they could hear the receiver, regeneration receiver signal. And one guy was able to hear it 3 miles away. So you could see that even when receiving, it was potentially dangerous, because if they knew where you were listening, then it was just like having a transmitter on. That was one of the weaknesses of the Paraset, was that because it was so basic, it was very easy to trace, as it were. Now, the modern Bayou jumper could conceivably have the same problem, but they were smart enough to put in a RF amplifier before the detector transistor, and that way it cut down dramatically on the receiver radiation. Next question.
Dave.
I had a couple of thoughts while you were doing your presentation. Clever tactics they might employ, and I'll run a couple of them by you. One would be if you have several agents in a geographical area, say within 20, 30 miles of each other, you could split a message up so that somebody would do 10 seconds, the next guy would pick it up and do 10 seconds, et cetera, et cetera. So your transmitter source would be jumping around, which would confuse the Germans. The same thing, same thing for the receiver oscillations. You did play it like a fox hunt and put them in different locations and turn them on and off during the time you knew another station was transmitting to confuse the direction finding. Just wondered if there was any discussion ever of any of the tactics that were used.
I have no knowledge that those tactics were used, but I'm far from an expert on this. And if Hiroki is here, maybe he could comment, because he has done a lot of research into the Parasets and how they were used. And he's also built several beautiful replicas. Are you still here, Hiroki? I don't see his.
Well, yes, he's still on the list, but you might want to ask him to unmute his mic, give him an invitation.
Right. Anyway, whether or not those tactics were used, it might make a fun exercise.
Oh, I think we've got
There he is.
Hiroki. Hello.
Hiroki.
Hi, good evening. Yeah, I'm sorry,
evening.
my internet connection has been very iffy tonight, so I wasn't able to hear everything, but it was a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it very much. As to that question, I have not encountered any records of that type of tactical operations, but it's a great idea. It may have been used, but I haven't come across any record of it.
Thank you.
I think probably one reason it might not have been used is the fact that if you have 2 or 3 agents transmitting within, say, a small, relatively small area, that could actually potentially help the direction finders, because as soon as they got close to one, they might get a bearing on the other one. So having multiple stations on at the same time, I think might be a bit risky.
Well, I didn't mean at the same time. I meant you could send 10 seconds worth of your message, and then at an interval, somebody else in a different location could send more of the message, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe over 30 minutes to an hour, you sent the whole message, but you've done it in short bursts.
Very interesting.
There's another the aspect to this. No agents, the operators in the field were not allowed to communicate with each other. The SOE agents typically worked in a team of 3.
Okay, that makes sense.
Radio operator, and but in order to not to be caught by Germans, each team never communicated to each other directly on radio. They only use courier if they need to communicate with each other. So and also there aren't that many in terms of coverage of behind the Nazi line. There weren't that many radios, and the radio operators, as the presenter mentioned, were, it's a very, very risky business. And many radio operators were caught, and there was always running short of the radio operators. And so it's unlikely that the kind of tactic you mentioned was actually employed.
Okay, thank you.
So Bob, you have a question?
Yeah, I don't know if this is on topic or not, but were similar units used in the Pacific Theater?
Yes, they were. main British station to communicate with the people in the Japanese occupied areas was located in what was then Ceylon, Ceylon, which is now called Sri Lanka. And people in Southeast Asia and in China would communicate with the British main stations located in Sri Lanka.
Our long question? Unmute?
Yes, yeah.
There you go.
So, so Mark, when the radio was in CW, doing CW, could the receiver oscillator be used as a BFO?
Well, you have to understand how the regenerative receivers work. The regenerative receivers were designed for both copying AM and CW, and based on that, also potentially sideband, although they tend to be very drifty and very broad in their stability, that is, on these receivers. So if you were tuning to hear AM, for example, like the BBC, you would advance the regeneration control or reaction control, as they called it, until it began to oscillate. And you would notice that it was oscillating because the noise in the headphones would suddenly pick up and you'd hear static crashes, etc. So if you were listening for AM, you would then back it down to the point just before oscillation. Okay, so that would be for listening to AM. That would be the peak point, or the best point in the reaction or the regeneration mode for listening to AM. Now, if you want to listen to CW, you put it just over that point, and that's where the regenerative receiver was most sensitive for CW. So it had its own, if you wish to call it that, BFO, because the oscillator in the receiver was beating against the incoming CW signal, and the difference between the two was audio.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. That's good.
Okay.
Any other questions anybody has? Hiroki, would you like to add anything to what's been said, and have any additions, corrections, etc.?
Hold on, unmute.
Unmute, Hiroki. Unmute.
It was Mark, you did a wonderful job. You covered everything. So I don't have much to add.
Well, you should know I've read your book multiple times, and I think it's really excellent the way you researched it and put it together, and it's really quite a nice book to read. And the book is available on Kindle, for example, and the price is very reasonable. And refresh me, Hiroki, as to the title.
The title is The Paraset Radio, the story of World War II spy radio was the title. Now, I just learned a few days ago that DX Engineering started carry the paper version of it. Until recently, only the Kindle on Amazon was available in the US. And if you wanted a paper copy, you had to order it from RSGB, the Radio Society of Great Britain, the publisher. But now the DX Engineering is carrying my book. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they are charging $14 a book. Kindle version is, I think, $10, yeah, right?
Well, if no one has any other questions, I have nothing further to present. And I especially want to thank everyone for listening and for the attendance of our special guest, AH6CY. Thank you for taking time out to join with us this evening. Back to Alex.
Okay, well, thank you, Marc, for sharing such an important piece of radio history. And thank you, Hiroki. What an honor to have you with us tonight. And good luck with the book now that it's in print. So to find out more about Montgomery Amateur Radio Club, please go to our website at marcclub.org. And thank everybody. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. And thank you, Marc, for a terrific presentation. Fabulous. So this is W3JAG signing off for now. Good evening.
Oh, don't sign off quite yet.